Fala, parceria, tudo certo? Bora então, dar jeito na vida. Onde é que é nosso ruído?
Learning for most people involves a This becomes the memory palace that In this video, we're going to delve deeper into memory. Another key to memorization is to create meaningful groups that simplify the material. Let's say you wanted to remember 4 plants that help ward off vampires: garlic, rose, hawthorn, and mustard. The first letters abbreviate to GRHM, so all you need to do to remember is to use the image of a graham cracker. It's much easier to remember numbers by associating them with memorable events. The year 1965 might be when one of your relatives was born, for example. Or you can associate numbers with a numerical system you're familiar with. For example, 11.0 seconds is a good running time for the 100-meter dash. Or 75 might be the number of stitches on a knitting needle for the ski hats you like to make. Personally, I like to associate numbers with the feelings of when I was or will be at a given age. The number 18 is an easy one. That's the age when I went out into the world. By age 104, I hope to be an old but happy great-grandma. Many disciplines use memorable sentences to help students memorize concepts. The first letter of each word in the sentence is also the first letter of each word in a list that needs to be memorized. Medicine, for example, is laden with memorable mnemonics, among the cleaner of which are "some lovers try positions that they can't handle" to memorize the names of the carpal bones of the hand, and "old people from Texas eat spiders" for the cranial bones. Time after time, these kinds of memory tricks prove helpful. If you're memorizing something commonly used, see whether someone's come up with a particularly memorable memory trick by searching it out online. Otherwise, try coming up with your own. The memory palace technique is a particularly powerful way of grouping things you want to remember. It involves calling to mind a familiar place, like the layout of your house, and using it as a sort of a visual notepad where you can deposit the concept images that you want to remember. All you have to do is call to mind the place you're familiar with, your home, your route to school, or your favorite restaurant, and voila! In the blink of an imaginative eye, this becomes the memory palace that you'll use as your notepad. The memory palace technique is useful for remembering unrelated items, such as a grocery list. Milk, bread, eggs. To use the technique, you might imagine a gigantic bottle of milk just inside your front door, the bread plopped on the couch, and a cracked egg dribbling off the edge of the coffee table. In other words, you'd imagine yourself walking through a place you know well, coupled with shockingly memorable images of what you want to remember. If you're studying finance, sociology, chemistry, or what have you, and you have lists to remember, you could use this same approach. The first time you do this, it will be slow. It takes a bit of time to conjure up a solid mental image, but the more you do it, the quicker it becomes. The memory palace technique is useful for remembering unrelated items, such as a grocery list. Milk, bread, eggs. To use the technique, you might imagine a gigantic bottle of milk just inside your front door. In other words, you'd imagine yourself walking through a place you know well, coupled with shockingly memorable images of what you want to remember. If you're studying finance, sociology, chemistry, or what have you, and you have lists to remember, you could use this same approach. The first time you do this, it will be slow. It takes a bit of time to conjure up a solid mental image, but the more you do it, the quicker it becomes. One study showed that a person using the memory palace technique could remember more than 95% of a 40 to 50 item list after only one or two practice mental walks where the items were placed on the grounds of the local university. In using the mind this way, memorization can become an outstanding exercise in creativity that simultaneously builds neural hooks for even more creativity. Purists might sniff that using oddball memorization gimmicks isn't really learning. But research has shown that students who use these kinds of tricks outperform those who don't. In addition, imaging research on how people become experts shows that such memory tools speed up the acquisition of both chunks and big picture templates, helping transform novices to semi-experts much more quickly, even in a matter of weeks. Memory tricks allow people to expand their working memory with easy access to long-term memory. What's more, the memory process itself becomes an exercise in creativity. The more you memorize using these innovative techniques, the more creative you become. This is because you're building these wild, unexpected possibilities for future connections early on, even as you're first internalizing the ideas. The more you practice this type of memory muscle, so to speak, the more easily you'll be able to remember. Where at first it may take 15 minutes to build an evocative image for an equation and embed it, say, in the kitchen sink of your memory palace, it can later take only minutes or seconds to perform a similar task. You'll also realize that as you begin to internalize key aspects of the material, taking a little time to commit the most important points to memory, you come to understand it much more deeply. The formulas will mean far more to you than they would if you simply looked them up in a book. And you'll be able to sling those formulas around much more proficiently on tests and in real-world applications. You may say, well, you're just not that creative. An equation or theory could hardly have its own grandiose motivations or persnickety emotional needs to help you understand and remember it. But always remember, your childlike creativity is still there inside you. You just need to reach out to it. I'm Barbara Oakley. Thanks for learning how to learn. Learning to use your memory in a more disciplined yet creative manner helps you learn to focus your attention, even as you create wild, diffuse connections that build stronger memories. Here are the key ideas about memory we've covered. In this course, we discussed two main memory systems involved in your ability to chunk concepts. The first is long-term memory, which is like a storage warehouse. You need to practice and repeat in order to help store items in long-term memory so you can retrieve them more easily. Practicing and repeating all in one day is a bad idea. You want to extend your practice to several days. This is why tackling procrastination is important. It helps you build better memories because you start earlier. The second is working memory, which is like a poor blackboard that quickly fades. You can only hold about 4 items in your working memory. When you master a technique or concept, in some sense, it compacts the ideas so they can occupy less space in your working memory when you do bring them to mind. This frees your mental thinking space so that it can more easily grapple with other ideas. We have outstanding visual and spatial memory systems. If you tap into those systems, it will help improve your memory. To begin tapping into your visual memory system, try making a very memorable visual image representing one key item you want to remember. Beyond merely seeing, try to feel, to hear, and even to smell something you're trying to remember. The funnier and more evocative the images, the better. As always, repetition over several days is really helpful. Another key to memorization is to create meaningful groups that simplify the material. Try associating numbers with years or with systems you're familiar with, like running times. Many disciplines use memorable sentences. The memory palace technique, placing memorable images in a scene that's familiar to you, allows you to dip into the strength of your visual memory system, providing a particularly powerful way of grouping things you want to remember. By making meaningful groups and abbreviations, you can simplify and chunk what you're trying to learn so you can more easily store it in memory. And by memorizing material you understand, you can internalize the material in a profound way. You're reinforcing the mental library you need to become a genuine master of the material. Happy memories. I'm Barbara Oakley. Thanks for learning how to learn. In this video, we're going to talk about some essential ideas in getting your learning on track. The importance of recall, illusions of competence in learning, mini-testing, and the value of making mistakes. One of the most common approaches for trying to learn material from a book or from notes is simply to reread it. But psychologist Jeffrey Koppicki has shown that this approach is actually much less productive than another very simple technique, recall. After you've read the material, simply look away and see what you can recall from the material you've just read. Koppicki's research, published in the journal Science, provided solid evidence along these lines. Students studied a scientific text and then practiced it by His research, published in the journal Science, provided solid evidence along these lines. Students studied a scientific text and then practiced it by recalling as much of the information as they could. Then they restudied the text and recalled it again. That is, they tried to remember the key ideas once more. The results? In the same amount of time, by simply practicing and recalling the material, students learned far more and at a much deeper level than they did using any other approach, including simply rereading the text a number of times or drawing concept maps that supposedly enriched the relationships in the materials under study. This improved learning comes whether students take a formal test or just informally test themselves. This gives an important reminder. When we retrieve knowledge, we're not just being mindless robots. The retrieval process itself enhances deep learning and helps us to begin forming chunks. It's almost as if the recall process helps build in little neural hooks that we can hang our thinking on. Even more of a surprise to researchers was that the students themselves predicted that simply reading and recalling the materials wasn't the best way to learn. They thought concept mapping, drawing diagrams that show the relationship between concepts, would be the best. But if you're trying to build connections between chunks before the basic chunks are embedded in the brain, it doesn't work as well. It's like trying to learn advanced strategy in chess before you even understand the basic concepts of how the pieces move. Using recall, mental retrieval of the key ideas, rather than passive rereading, will make your study time more focused and effective. The only time rereading text seems to be effective is if you let time pass between the rereadings so that it becomes more of an exercise in spaced repetition. One way to think about this type of learning and recall is shown right here. As we mentioned earlier, there are 4 slots in working memory. When you're first learning how to understand a concept or a technique to solve a problem, your entire working memory is involved in the process, as shown by this sort of mad tangle of connections between the 4 slots of working memory. As you begin to chunk the concept, you will feel it connecting more easily and smoothly in your mind. Once the concept is chunked, it takes up only 1 slot in working memory. It simultaneously becomes one smooth strand that's easy to follow and to use to make new connections. The rest of your working memory is left clear. That dangling strand of chunked material has, in some sense, increased the amount of information available to your working memory. It's as if the slot in working memory is a hyperlink that's been connected to a great big web page. Now you understand why it is key that you are the one doing the problem solving or mastering the concepts, not whoever wrote the solution manual or book on whatever subject you're studying. If you just look at the solution, for example, and then tell yourself, oh yeah, I see why they did that, then the solution is not really yours. You've done almost nothing to knit those concepts into your own underlying neural circuitry. Merely glancing at a solution and thinking you truly know it yourself is one of the most common illusions of competence in learning. You must have the information persisting in your memory if you're to. Now you understand why it is key that you are the one doing the problem solving or mastering the concepts, not whoever wrote the solution manual or book on whatever subject you're studying. If you just look at the solution, for example, and then tell yourself, oh yeah, I see why they did that, then the solution is not really yours. You've done almost enough yourself is one of the most common illusions of competence in learning. You must have the information persisting in your memory if you're to master the material well enough to do well on tests and to think creatively with it. In a related vein, you may be surprised to learn that highlighting and underlining must be done very carefully. Otherwise, it can not only be ineffective, but also misleading. It's as if making lots of motions with your hand can fool you into thinking you've placed the concept in your brain. If you do mark up the text, try to look for main ideas before making any marks and try to keep your underlining or highlighting to a minimum, one sentence or less per paragraph. One sentence or less per paragraph. On the other hand, words or notes in a margin that synthesize key concepts are a very good idea. Jeff Karpicki, the same researcher who's done such important work related to recall, has also done research on a related topic, illusions of competence in learning. The reason students like to keep rereading their notes or a textbook is that when they have the book, or Google, open right in front of them, it provides the illusion that the material is also in their brains. But it's not. Because it can be easier to look at the book instead of recalling, students persist in their illusion, studying in a way that just isn't very effective. This is a reminder that just wanting to learn the material and spending a lot of time with it doesn't guarantee you'll actually learn it. A super helpful way to make sure you're learning and not fooling yourself with illusions of competence is to test yourself on whatever you're learning. In some sense, that's what recall is actually doing, allowing you to see whether or not it's yourself on whatever you're learning. In some sense, that's what recall is actually doing, allowing you to see whether or not you really grasped an idea. If you make a mistake in what you're doing, it's actually a very good thing. You want to try not to repeat your mistakes, of course, but mistakes are very valuable to make in your little self-tests before high-stakes real tests, because they allow you to make repairs in your thinking flaws. Bit by bit, mistakes help correct your thinking so that you can learn better and do better. As you know now, recall is a powerful tool. But here's another tip. Recalling material when you're outside your usual place of study can also help you strengthen your grasp of the material. You don't realize it, but when you're learning something new, you can often take in subliminal cues from the room and the space around you at the time you were originally learning the material. This can throw you off when you take tests because you often take tests in a room that's different from the room you were learning in. By recalling and thinking about the material when you were in various physical environments, you become independent of the cues from any one given location. That helps you avoid the problem of the test room being different from where you originally learned the material. I'm Barbara Oakley. Thanks for learning about learning. In some sense, that's what recall is actually doing, allowing you to see whether or not you really grasped an idea. If you make a mistake in what you're doing, it's actually a very good thing. You want to try not to repeat your mistakes, of course, but mistakes are very valuable to make in your little self-tests before high-stakes real tests, because they allow you to make repairs in your thinking flaws. Bit by bit, mistakes help correct your thinking so that you can learn better and do better. As you know now, recall is a powerful tool. But here's another tip. Recalling material when you're outside your usual place.
Welcome back. It is hard to learn when you're not into it. But if it's something you're really interested in, learning is easy. Why is that? Most of the neurons in your cortex carry information about what is happening around you and what you're doing. Your brain also has a set of diffusely projecting systems of neuromodulators that carry information not about the content of an experience, but its importance and value to your future. Neuromodulators are chemicals that influence how a neuron responds to other neurons, and today we will discuss three of them: acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin. Acetylcholine neurons form neuromodulatory connections to the cortex that are particularly important for focused learning when you are paying close attention. These acetylcholine neurons project widely and activate circuits that control synaptic plasticity, leading to new long-term memory. Neuromodulators also have a profound impact on your unconscious mind. One of the great brain discoveries in my lifetime has been that our motivation is controlled by a particular chemical substance called dopamine, which is found in a small set of neurons in our brainstem, shown here in orange. These dopamine neurons are part of a large brain system that controls reward learning, and in particular in the basal ganglia, which is located in the green region above the dopamine neurons and below the cortex at the top of the brain. Dopamine is released from these neurons when we receive an unexpected reward. Dopamine signals project widely and have a very powerful effect on learning. And this is something that also affects decision making and even the value of sensory inputs. Dopamine is in the business of predicting future rewards and not just the immediate reward. This can motivate you to do something that may not be rewarding right now, but will lead to a much better reward in the future. Addictive drugs artificially increase dopamine activity and fool your brain into thinking that something wonderful has just happened. In fact, just the opposite has just happened. This leads to craving and dependence, which can hijack your free will and can motivate actions that are harmful to you. Loss of dopamine neurons leads to a lack of motivation and something called anhedonia, which is a loss of interest in things that once gave you pleasure. Severe loss of dopamine neurons causes resting tremor, slowness, rejection. This can motivate you to do something that may not be rewarding right now, but will lead to a much better reward in the future. Addictive drugs artificially increase dopamine activity and fool your brain into thinking that something wonderful has just happened. In fact, just the opposite has just happened. This leads to craving and dependence, which can hijack your free will and can motivate actions that are harmful to you. Loss of dopamine neurons leads to a lack of motivation and something called anhedonia, which is a loss of interest in things that once gave you pleasure. Severe loss of dopamine neurons causes resting tremor, slowness, rigidity. This is called Parkinson's disease. Ultimately, it leads to catatonia, a complete lack of any movement. Dopamine neurons are part of the unconscious part of your brain that you learned about in the first week. When you promise to treat yourself to something after a study section, you are tapping into your dopamine system. Serotonin is a third diffuse neuromodulatory system that strongly affects your social life. In monkey troops, the alpha male has the highest level of serotonin activity, and the lowest ranking male has the lowest levels. Prozac, which is prescribed for clinical depression, raises the level of serotonin activity. The level of serotonin is also closely linked to risk-taking behavior, with higher risk in lower serotonin monkeys. Inmates in jail for violent crimes have some of the lowest levels of serotonin activity in society. Finally, your emotions strongly affect learning, as you are well aware. Emotions were once thought to be separate from cognition, but recent research has shown that emotions are intertwined with perception and attention and interact with learning and memory. The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure shown here, nestled down at the base of the brain, is one of the major centers where cognition and emotion are effectively integrated. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, which together with the hippocampus is involved in processing memory and decision-making, as well as regulating emotional reactions. You will want to keep your amygdala happy to be an effective learner. The emotions and your neuromodulatory systems are slower than perception and action, but are no less important for successful learning. If you want to learn more about acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin, look them up on brainfacts.org, a website that is filled with valuable facts about your brain. I'm Terry Sinofsky. Happy learning until we meet again. Dopamine signals project widely and have a very powerful effect on learning. And this is something that also affects decision making and even the value of sensory inputs. Dopamine is in the business of predicting future rewards and not just the immediate reward. This can motivate you to do something that may not be rewarding right now, but will lead to a much better reward in the future. Addictive drugs artificially increase dopamine activity and fool your brain into thinking that something wonderful has just happened. In fact, just the opposite has just happened. This leads to craving and dependence. Which is a loss of interest in things. Loss of dopamine neurons leads to a lack of motivation and something called anhedonia, which is a loss of interest in things that once gave you pleasure. Severe loss of dopamine neurons causes resting tremor, slowness, rigidity. This is called Parkinson's disease. Ultimately,
Esse intervalinho, então.
Did you always think that learning was due to the addition of new cells in the brain?
Then, you're not the only one. Researchers found that approximately 82% of pre-service teachers thought the same or did not know how learning in the brain works.
Well, actually, this is not true, and this is what we call a neuromyth.
In this video, we will therefore explain the real
Oi pessoal, aqui é a Amanda do Can Hub. Sejam bem-vindos à nossa videoaula sobre a histologia dos neurônios. Neste vídeo, nós vamos ver os neurônios a nível microscópico e identificar os pequenos componentes que formam estas células. Primeiramente, o que é um neurônio? Um neurônio, ou célula nervosa, é uma célula especializada que transmite pulsos eletromagnéticos através do corpo. Eles podem transmitir informações em uma ou em duas direções. Neurônios eferentes carregam informações do encéfalo até os tecidos com o qual eles se comunicam. Pode ser, por exemplo, para estimular o movimento em um músculo esquelético. Já os neurônios aferentes carregam informações de várias partes do corpo até o encéfalo. Isso te permite, por exemplo, sentir a dor de uma queimadura. Os neurônios são bem diversos e possuem uma enorme variedade de padrões de ramificações e diferentes tamanhos. Alguns neurônios são longos, largos e mielinizados, enquanto outros são curtos, finos e desmielinizados. Nesta videoaula, nós vamos ver as estruturas que formam um neurônio e que são visíveis em lâminas histológicas, bem como os diferentes tipos de neurônios baseados na sua forma. Especificamente, nós iremos cobrir as principais partes dos neurônios, como o corpo celular, dendritos e axônio, e vamos até mergulhar um pouco mais fundo nos detalhes das estruturas dentro do corpo celular, como o núcleo e os corpos de níquel. Nós também veremos alguns detalhes dos axônios e identificaremos os axônios mielinizados e desmielinizados. Depois veremos os diferentes tipos de neurônios, incluindo os multipolares, bipolares, unipolares e pseudo-unipolares. Por fim, veremos uma condição clínica e como ela se apresenta em uma lâmina histológica do tecido nervoso. Vamos começar! Neurônios são formados por três partes: um corpo celular, múltiplos dendritos e um axônio único. Os dendritos recebem informação enquanto o axônio transfere informação para outros neurônios. Vamos começar com o corpo celular. O corpo celular, que às vezes é chamado de pericário ou soma, contém um núcleo e outras organelas cercadas por sua membrana citoplasmática. Nesta imagem, nós podemos ver o corpo celular destacado em verde. Para identificá-los nas lâminas histológicas, podemos olhar para a estrutura que possui um formato dilatado, maior e geralmente mais arredondado do que as projeções. Aqui temos outro exemplo de um corpo celular nesta imagem. Outra maneira de identificar o corpo celular é identificando o núcleo dentro dele. Esta é a estrutura que nós podemos ver destacada em verde à esquerda. Nesta coloração, ela parece mais escura do que as outras estruturas do corpo celular. Ele será a maior estrutura esférica dentro do corpo celular. Os núcleos são anormalmente grandes nos neurônios. Como em todas as células, é no núcleo que está o DNA. À esquerda, as várias pequenas estruturas granulares que podemos ver destacadas no corpo celular deste neurônio são chamadas de corpos de níquel. Corpos de níquel são coleções granulares de retículo endoplasmático rugoso e ribossomos livres, que podem ser encontrados no corpo celular. Como estas estruturas contribuem para a síntese de proteínas, isto mostra que os neurônios têm alta atividade sintética. Dependendo da atividade do neurônio, o número de corpos de níquel vai variar. O soma, ou corpo celular, possui numerosas projeções citoplasmáticas que se ramificam em sua superfície. Nós podemos ver duas nesta imagem destacada em verde à direita. Estes são os dendritos. Os dendritos formam conexões com outros neurônios para receber as informações e depois conduzem os impulsos em direção ao corpo celular. Existem projeções menores, chamadas de espinhas dendríticas, que se ramificam de cada um dos dendritos. Infelizmente, nós não podemos vê-las nesta lâmina histológica. Espinhas dendríticas são as partes do dendrito que formam sinapse com outras células. A sinapse é onde ocorre a comunicação entre duas células. Sinapses podem ocorrer não somente entre dois neurônios, mas também entre um neurônio e uma fibra muscular. Se uma sinapse está ocorrendo com outro neurônio, as espinhas dendríticas do neurônio estão fazendo esta sinapse com o axônio do outro neurônio. O axônio é uma projeção única do corpo celular que carrega a informação do corpo celular para outra célula. Para diferenciar axônios e dendritos, você pode olhar para alguns detalhes. Primeiramente, os axônios normalmente são muito mais longos que os dendritos. Seu comprimento pode variar, mas os axônios podem ter mais de 1 metro de comprimento. Além disso, os axônios possuem um trajeto mais reto do que os dendritos. Os dendritos normalmente vão se dobrar e se torcer para encontrar um axônio. O contrário não ocorre. Outra observação é que as ramificações dos axônios estão limitadas às terminações distais, enquanto os dendritos podem se ramificar antes. E, finalmente, o local onde os axônios se originam do corpo celular é bem distinto. O axônio se origina do corpo celular através do cone axonal. Esta é uma região em forma de pirâmide que está destacada em verde na imagem da direita. Nesta nova imagem, estamos olhando para um corte transversal de um nervo periférico. Dentro do nervo existem vários neurônios, alguns dos quais são mostrados em zoom neste corte. Quando olhamos para esta imagem, nós temos que imaginar que o nervo está viajando em nossa direção. Então, as estruturas destacadas em verde são as extremidades cortadas dos axônios que estão viajando em nossa direção, revestidos por uma bainha isolante. Esta bainha isolante que circunda os axônios é o que agora nós podemos ver destacado em verde. Esta bainha é conhecida como mielina. Sua principal função é aumentar a velocidade dos impulsos que viajam pelo neurônio. Quando tiramos o destaque em verde, nós podemos ver que a mielina é, na verdade, um espaço em branco. Isto é porque durante o processo de coloração, o álcool usado remove a mielina e o que fica é um espaço vazio. Entretanto, axônios nodais são mielinizados. Esta nova imagem, à direita, nos mostra a aparência de axônios desmielinizados em um corte transversal. Eles são muito mais finos, já que eles não possuem várias camadas de mielina ao redor dos axônios. Nós podemos ver os axônios dos neurônios desmielinizados dentro dos círculos verdes. Só para dar outra perspectiva da organização dos nervos periféricos, nós daremos uma olhada nestas próximas imagens. Nas imagens, nós estamos olhando para cortes longitudinais de um nervo. Existem muitos neurônios correndo em paralelo na tela. Na imagem da esquerda, nós podemos ver os axônios destacados em verde. Revestindo os axônios, existem bainhas de mielina, que nós podemos ver destacadas em verde na imagem da direita. Agora que nós vimos os componentes dos neurônios, nós vamos dar uma olhada nos tipos de neurônios e descobrir os vários formatos que eles podem ter. Neurônios podem ser classificados com base no número de processos ou projeções que emergem do corpo celular. Hoje nós vamos ver os neurônios multipolar, bipolar, unipolar e pseudo-unipolar. Nesta imagem, nós podemos ver o neurônio multipolar destacado em verde. Quando falamos em polaridade, estamos olhando para o número de projeções que saem do corpo celular do neurônio. Estes tipos celulares possuem um único axônio que se estende de uma extremidade do corpo celular e dois outros dendritos que se originam do outro lado do corpo celular. Por causa das numerosas ramificações, este neurônio é chamado de multipolar. Nesta imagem, nós podemos ver 3 projeções principais. O único axônio está aqui, e aqui estão 2 árvores dendríticas, uma aqui e a segunda aqui. Neurônios multipolares são os neurônios mais comuns e os mais predominantes no encéfalo e na medula espinal. Pelo fato deles terem múltiplos dendritos, eles podem receber impulsos de vários outros neurônios. Esta comunicação expandida significa que a capacidade funcional do sistema nervoso é muito maior. Neurônios bipolares, como o nome sugere, possuem 2 projeções principais. Nessa imagem, nós podemos ver um único axônio se projetando aqui do corpo celular e a árvore dendrítica solitária da outra extremidade aqui. Células bipolares só estão associadas com impulsos sensoriais aferentes. Elas são encontradas na cóclea vestibular, ou no sistema de audição e equilíbrio, no sistema olfatório e no sistema ocular ou visual. Nesta imagem da direita, nós podemos ver alguns neurônios bipolares destacados dentro da camada nuclear interna da retina, no fundo do olho. Outro subtipo de neurônio é o neurônio unipolar. Estes neurônios possuem uma única projeção surgindo do soma. Nesta imagem, nós podemos ver a projeção única do corpo esférico. Este é o axônio. Não existem ramos dendríticos se projetando de outras regiões da membrana celular, o que significa que para outros neurônios se comunicarem com neurônios unipolares, seus axônios têm que formar uma sinapse com o soma do neurônio unipolar. Estas células, normalmente, são encontradas nos nervos periféricos e gânglios sensoriais. Finalmente, nós iremos dar uma olhada no neurônio pseudo-unipolar. Estes neurônios são semelhantes aos neurônios unipolares, já que eles só possuem uma projeção, deixando o corpo celular. A diferença é que a projeção única se bifurca em 2 ramos. Nesta imagem, o corpo celular está aqui. Emergindo dele está uma única projeção, e neste ponto ela se bifurca em seus 2 ramos, um aqui e outro aqui. Neurônios pseudo-unipolares se originam como neurônios bipolares, com 2 projeções. Estas 2 projeções, então, se unem e se fundem para formar um segmento proximal comum, do qual os 2 ramos surgem. Neurônios pseudo-unipolares são encontrados no gânglio da raiz dorsal, que fica dentro da estrutura destacada em verde nesta imagem. Nós estamos olhando para uma parte da coluna vertebral de uma vista póstero-lateral. A medula espinal está aqui, correndo no canal vertebral, e o gânglio da raiz dorsal está dentro da estrutura que está saindo através do forame intervertebral. Nesta próxima imagem, nós estamos olhando para a coluna vertebral em um corte transversal, e nós podemos ver o gânglio da raiz dorsal isolado um pouco melhor. Aqui está o corpo vertebral, o arco vertebral e a medula espinal correndo no forame vertebral. O gânglio da raiz dorsal está destacado em verde em ambos os lados. Gânglio é o nome de uma coleção de corpos celulares que está localizada no sistema nervoso periférico. Os corpos celulares dos neurônios pseudo-unipolares estão localizados no gânglio da raiz dorsal. Um ramo do axônio vai até a medula espinal, enquanto o outro vai para a periferia. Nesta imagem histológica, as estruturas destacadas em verde são os corpos celulares dos neurônios pseudo-unipolares localizados no gânglio da raiz dorsal. Dentro dos corpos celulares, a estrutura corada de mais claro é o núcleo, e a estrutura corada de mais escuro, dentro do núcleo, é o nucleolo. Em um gânglio da raiz dorsal, todos os corpos celulares são tipicamente organizados em agrupamentos próximos, como podemos ver nessa imagem. As fibras nervosas que viajam até o corpo celular e a partir dele são vistas correndo entre alguns destes grupos aqui e aqui. Lâminas histológicas do tecido nervoso podem nos mostrar muito sobre o que está acontecendo no sistema nervoso de alguém. O que nós vamos ver brevemente hoje é o que pode ser visto em alguém com esclerose múltipla ou EM, que é uma condição autoimune que afeta parte do sistema nervoso central, ou seja, partes do encéfalo e ou da medula espinal. As células imunes da pessoa, na verdade, atacam a mielina que reveste os axônios no SNC. Isto significa que a bainha de mielina é perdida de forma que os impulsos não podem percorrer os axônios tão rapidamente como deveriam. E isto ocorre em diferentes áreas, em pessoas diferentes, levando a uma ampla variedade de sintomas, como problemas de equilíbrio, sensibilidade, visão, movimentos e outros. Nesta imagem microscópica do tecido nervoso central, nós podemos ver alguns achados característicos de esclerose múltipla, sendo o primeiro esta lesão. Esta lesão, na verdade, é um local de perda de mielina, ou seja, áreas onde as células imunes atacaram a mielina. Você pode ver que, comparado com a área azul à direita da imagem, existem alguns espaços vazios redondos. Estes espaços são mielina, e na área à esquerda, eles foram destruídos. A outra característica é a grande quantidade de macrófagos, que são as estruturas coradas em marrom. Macrófagos são um tipo de leucócito que ajuda o corpo a limpar os debris celulares. Para fazer isso, eles engolem ou fagocitam estes debris e os digerem. No caso da esclerose múltipla, os macrófagos estão degradando o que sobrou das bainhas de mielina destruídas. Então, agora que você é um expert na histologia dos neurônios, antes de eu ir, vamos fazer uma rápida
The ability to combine chunks in new and original ways underlies a lot of historical innovation. Bill Gates and other industry leaders set aside extended, week-long reading periods so that they can hold many and varied ideas in mind during one time. This helps generate their own innovative thinking by allowing fresh in mind, not yet forgotten ideas to network amongst themselves. Basically, what people do to enhance their knowledge and gain expertise is to gradually build the number of chunks in their mind, valuable bits of information they can piece together in new and creative ways. Chess masters, for example, can easily access thousands of different chess patterns. Musicians, linguists, and scientists can each access similar chunks of knowledge in their own disciplines. The bigger and more well-practiced your chunked mental library, whatever the subject you're learning, the more easily you'll be able to solve problems and figure out solutions. As we'll discover soon, chunking isn't all you'll need to develop creative flexibility in your learning, but it's an important component. Chunks can also help you understand new concepts. This is because when you grasp one chunk, you'll find that that chunk can be related in surprising ways to similar chunks, not only in that field, but also in very different fields. This idea is called transfer. For example, concepts and problem-solving methods you learned for physics can be very similar to chunked concepts in business. I found some aspects of language learning were very helpful for me when I later began to learn computer programming. A chunk is a way of compressing information much more compactly. As you gain more experience in chunking in any particular subject, you'll see that the chunks you're able to create are bigger. In some sense, the ribbons are longer. Not only are those ribbons longer, but the neural patterns are in some sense darker. They're more solid and firmly ingrained. If you have a library of concepts and solutions internalized as chunked patterns, you can think of it as a collection or a library of neural patterns. When you're trying to figure something out, if you have a good library of these chunks, you can more easily skip to the right solution by, metaphorically speaking, listening to whispers from your diffuse mode. Your diffuse mode can help you connect two or more chunks together in new ways to solve novel problems. Another way to think of it is this. As you build each chunk, it is filling in a part of your larger knowledge picture. But if you don't practice with your growing chunks, they can remain faint, and it's harder to put together the big picture of what you're trying to learn. In building a chunked library, you're training your brain to recognize not only a specific concept, but different types and classes of concepts so that you can automatically know how to solve quickly or handle whatever you encounter. You'll start to see patterns that simplify problem solving for you, and will soon find that different solution techniques are lurking at the edge of your memory. Before midterms or finals, it can be easy to brush up and have these solutions at the mental ready. There are two ways to figure something out or to solve problems. First, through sequential, step-by-step reasoning, and second, through a more holistic intuition. Sequential thinking, where each small step leads deliberately towards a solution, involves the focused mode. Intuition, on the other hand, often seems to require this creative, diffuse mode linking of several seemingly different focused mode thoughts. Most difficult problems and concepts are grasped through intuition because these new ideas make a leap away from what you're familiar with. Keep in mind that the diffuse mode's semi-random way of making connections means that the solutions it provides should be very carefully verified using the focused mode. Intuitive insights aren't always correct. You may think there are so many problems and concepts just in a single section or chapter of whatever you're studying, there's just no way to learn them all. This is where the law of serendipity comes into play. Lady Luck favors the one who tries. Just focus on whatever section you're studying. You'll find that once you put that first problem or concept in your mental library, whatever it is, then the second concept will go in a little more easily, and the third more easily still. Not that all of this is a snap, but it does get easier. I'm Barbara Oakley. Thanks for learning about learning.
Então era isso, parceria. Até amanhã para outra sessão de estudos. Valeu!